Hey, and welcome back. It's time to talk about the voicing page in the center window. So we've gone through the oscillator page, key track oscillator, key track filter, and now we're on to voicing. And there's a lot here, but it will all make sense very shortly. So let's just go through this step by step. On the left-hand side of the window, we have a voicing section. And there are two boxes here, one labeled Max, one labeled Unisono. The number that is in the Max box indicates the maximum number of voices that can be played at the same time. And so when we're in polyphonic mode here, you can play more than one note at a time, right? Like that. You can actually play up to 8 voices, and then once you get above 8, you can actually play 8 notes, 8 separate notes, as long as you have 8 fingers on the keyboard. Once you get above 8, then the most recent note will not be played. Okay. Now the unisono control over here is the number of voices per note. So right now that it's on 1, when I just play one note, I'm getting just one voice. But I can increase this, and now I have 3 voices per note. Now, let's move this back down to 2 to make our math easier. So if I have unisono on 2, that means I can only play 4 different notes, because that will get me up to the maximum voice of 8 that's assigned here. Now you can always increase this. I think it goes up to 64. The maximum voices of 64. But just remember that every voice is computed independently by the software. So, you're going to start slowing down your machine pretty bad if you have that many voices. Your CPU will overload. Okay, now we have these three polyphonic modes over here. Number 1 is polyphonic, meaning I can play more than one note at a time. I'm going to change that back down to 1. In other words, you can play chords. Monophonic means one note at a time. If I try to play chords, it just will move on to another note. Monorotate is almost the exact same thing as monophonic. When you strike a key and then strike a second key, that first note will be rolled off or faded out just really quickly, but just so that you don't get a click from triggering a new note. Okay, so below the polyphonic options, we have some trigger options. The always trigger restarts the modulation sources whenever a new MIDI note message is received. The legato trigger function does not restart the modulation source if the notes are being played together. So if you play a note, let go, then play another note, it will restart it, just like with the always. But in legato, if I'm playing 2 notes or several notes tied together, it will not restart the modulation source. They'll just jump in together. The legato triller function will restart the modulation once all notes have been released. So when it receives a new MIDI message, but all notes have been released. But if, for example, if you're holding a note down and you are playing other notes above it, then it will not restart the modulation source for each of those new notes. That's kind of why it's called trill. Now it's time to move over here to the unisono spread area. And so I'm going to increase my unisono to 2 now to demonstrate what's going on here. So you can sort of hear the difference there when I'm starting to layer voices. Okay, so our unisono is on 2, and now we have these 3 options over here. Pitch cutoff, wavetable position, and pan position. And by default, these are set to off, so I'm going to have to click the word off to turn it on. And now, if I increase this fader just a little bit, you'll start to hear what's happening here in the pitch cutoff. You can hear that weird phase that's happening because I'm detuning my two voices just ever so slightly. So if I want to change the range of this fader, I can use this numerical value here. I can bring it all the way up to 12, for example, or negative 12. So in the center, my notes, my two voices are pretty much lined up now. But on the left, I have a full octave, well, 2 octave spread actually, and the same thing on the right. So that's a little extreme, you know, you're probably going to want to keep it to maybe negative 1 and 1. So that you can adjust that as you see fit. But that's really cool for making sort of those huge stacked rave sounds that are just like that detuned hardcore lead. Now that we have these 2 buttons over here centered in chord, let's increase our unisono to 4. And let's demonstrate the difference between centered and chord. Centered means that the different voices are arranged symmetrically around the original note. Chord means that the voices are split alternatively below and above the main pitch. So centered you want to use when you're using small modulation amounts like this. Maybe 0 to 1. Let's hear that. Okay, that's what you want to have for that. For the chord, if I increase this a little bit. So you can see how I just built a chord there just by detuning each one a little bit and finding the right spot on the fader here. Okay, so that's the pitch cutoff row, and I can just turn it off. Next is the wavetable position. And so let's say I have my wavetable position right here in the middle on my oscillator 1. This fader is expressed as a percentage, and this means that I'm just spreading out the wavetable position of the other voices in my unisono voice stack around that wavetable position. So that's kind of just another thing to thicken up the sound. So you can hear some of the spreading out of those harmonics. And lastly, we have the panoramic position, which is just the stereo field. So when I have this fader right in the middle, it says mono here. That means that I'm just receiving one mono signal in the center. If I pull it out to the right, it's a full stereo signal. And that's cool if you have these quite differentiated voices like this, maybe. You can really hear that it just makes it sound really big. The dimension is very large. Here's back in the center. Or you can have an inverted stereo image this way. Or any blend of the two, if you just want a little bit of stereo image. So, this is what's cool about this general page, the voicing page, is that we haven't actually changed any of the other parameters. We've just used some of these voicing parameters to already shape a really interesting sound, and then you can just imagine where you can go from there, adding the modulation sources and adding the filters and the effects. Okay, so it's a really cool way to beef up your sound and make it really thick and exciting. So that's the voicing general page. Let's see you in the next lecture.